Hey, coming at you all the way live from the lower bottoms of West Oakland. It's Soundwaves. I'm recording this on May 25th, 2020, in the year of coronavirus lockdown, shelter in place. And it is Memorial Day. It's a holiday. And in the wee hours of this wonderful holiday, trying to go to sleep, another car and RV exploded right outside my window. This one was pretty close. I thought someone was breaking in my car, so I went outside, and then I was getting hit with the shrapnel of an RV and car blowing up. So how did you spend your holiday morning? That being said, on today's show, I have someone I've been trying to talk to for a while now, and I'm very excited to get this interview. Alex Vitale, who wrote a book called The End of Policing. And his book is hitting even more home with me than it did before, working with the unhoused population here in Oakland, California. And from time to time having to deal with police, and then seeing the effect that over-policing has on the people that I have to work with on a daily basis. It is constantly moving a boulder uphill in this line of work. I think I've said it before. I'll say it again. I may not be best friends with every coworker I have, but I know that everyone is here because you have to have your heart in the right place. You can't do this type of work just for a check. You can't check out like you would at a normal desk job. The stories are just way too real that you hear on a daily basis. The things you deal with are way too real. So that's why this guest is so important to me, and also to the theme of this show. I mean, part of this show is to kind of educate people on things that you don't hear a lot. And one thing you don't hear a lot on mainstream media is someone saying, hey, we need to abolish the use of police force in issues that we should be looking at as public health problems and not criminalizing behaviors. We shouldn't be criminalizing certain mental health behaviors. The war on drugs isn't working. Hasn't worked. More police officers isn't going to help. Police in schools isn't helping. Body cameras aren't helping. So, all that being said, I would like to read a short quote from Alex Vitale. Liberals think the police rightly have a monopoly on using force in the interests of the state, which they believe represents society's general will. To retain this monopoly, the police must maintain their public legitimacy by acting in a way the public respects and within the rule of law, what is often referred to as procedural justice. For liberals, police reform is always a question of helping police sustain that legitimacy. The alternative would be to allow predators to run amok in society. Why are police waging a war on drugs, war on crime, war on disorder, and a war on terror? Are they really the best, most just way for the state to address these issues? As part of their uncritical understanding of state power, liberals tend to ignore or downplay these questions, as well as the profound legacy and continued active production of state-backed racial exploitation and domination. Rather than admit the central role of slavery, Jim Crow, mass incarceration, and over-policing in producing wealth for white people and denying basic life opportunities for black people, they prefer to focus on a few remedial programs backed up by a robust and quote unquote legitimate criminal justice system to transform black attitudes so that they are better able to compete in the labor market. As a result, black people always start from a diminished position that makes them both more likely to come into contact with the criminal justice system and be treated more harshly by it. The reality is that police have always been at the root of a system for managing and producing inequality. This is accomplished by suppressing social movements and tightly managing the behaviors of poor and non-white people in ways that benefit those already in positions of economic and political power. Police have always functioned as a force for controlling those on the losing end of these economic and political arrangements, quelling social upheavals that could no longer be managed by existing private, communal, and informal processes. This can be seen in the earliest origins of policing, which were tied to three basic social arrangements of inequality in the 18th century: slavery, colonialism, and the control of an industrial working class. This created what Alan Silver called a policed society, in which state power was significantly expanded to face down the demands for justice from those subject to these systems of domination and exploitation. As Christian Williams points out, the police represent the point of contact between the coercive apparatus of the state and the lives of its citizens. So I will stop talking and take a listen to my interview with author and professor Alex Vitale. All right, coming at you live all the way from the lower bottoms of West Oakland. This is Soundwaves. And today I have a very, very, very special guest. I saw this man speak. I want to say I saw maybe it was a year ago or 2 years ago on Chris Hedges' show on Contact is where I first got hip to your book.
Yeah, that was about 2 years ago.
We're speaking today with professor and author Alex Vitale, who wrote the book The End of Policing. Just the title had me shook and kind of like drawn into what Mr. Vitale had to say. I think I did mention this to you on my initial request to talk to you. I do work. I work for one of the emergency shelters we have here in Oakland, California. We have a lot of vacant hotels due to the shutdown, and we're using some of these hotels in California to help the unhoused shelter in place. It's an adventure, as you can imagine, on a daily basis to work in one of these facilities, because this is a whole new thing for everybody. There's no playbook to go by. That being said, I have to deal with law enforcement a little bit more than I'd like to in this situation. And I can honestly say your writings have put into perspective why, in some cases, in a lot of cases, having the police try to help with these, what are generally mental health issues, becomes extremely problematic. That are on site, that are trying to constantly find long-term housing for them after this is all over.
But are there support services so that, for instance, if they have, a mental health challenge, that the only option isn't just to call the police in?
Not on a 24-hour basis.
Right. So, I got my start doing this work at the San Francisco Coalition on Homelessness around 1990, when we started developing the supportive housing model, where there are on-site services so that we can help people maintain their housing
Mm-hmm.
uh, to without, for instance, needing to get the police involved in the vast majority of cases. So you have people on site with mental health, substance abuse, financial management kind of training,
Mm-hmm.
so that people and that can help just keep an eye on someone. Like if someone quits coming out of their room and has sort of disappeared, there's someone who can go intervene before it becomes a full blown crisis. Or if you notice that someone's mood or behavior is changing, well, maybe they quit taking their meds, or maybe the meds are not working in the same way and the dosage needs to be adjusted. And if you can do that as an early intervention, the outcomes are so much better than waiting till they get completely out of control and you end up having to call the police and the EMTs and an emergency room, and that's all extremely expensive and really fraught.
I feel, and this is just my opinion, I feel that it's more reactive than proactive, and it could be a numbers game as far as the amount of people that we have in the facility to the amount of help that we have. So more often than not, it's finding out, like to your point, it's finding out last minute, like, oh, someone's not taking their medication.
Right.
Uh-oh. That's why they just lit their room on fire.
Exactly. Exactly. Because usually the lighting your room on fire doesn't just happen overnight.
No.
That's the culmination of a destabilization that's happening over a longer period of time.
And also, I did not know that you worked in San Francisco. That's actually pretty cool.
Yeah, I used to write for the Street Sheet and do housing policy and healthcare policy and eventually civil rights work, which then is was a big part of how I got focused on policing issues, which was not what I originally studied in school or thought I would be doing. I was really interested in urban economic development, housing policy, community organizing, those kinds of things. And it was only when this big expansion in the criminalization of homelessness happens in the 1990s that I get drawn into asking a lot of questions about policing and seeing how what San Francisco and eventually a lot of cities did was that they basically gave up on the idea that they were going to house people and really solve homelessness, and instead decided we're just going to turn it over to the police to manage the problem in a way that reduces its impact on folks, because we're not actually going to fix the housing problem.
Now, I don't know if you were following what happened out here in West Oakland, actually, not too many blocks from where I'm speaking from now, where the moms occupied a vacant house.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things we did during that period of the early 90s in San Francisco was homes not jails. So we
Mm-hmm.
did we did organize we did a two-tier thing. We did private under the radar squats where we
Mm-hmm.
just help move people into places, and we bypass the meters on the utilities and then eventually try to get people's names on the utilities and provided food support and stuff. And then we did periodic high profile public squats, takeovers, where we knew we would get evicted, but the point was to make a big political stink. And we did them a few years in a row on Thanksgiving Day. And so that on Thanksgiving Day in the Bay Area, what you saw on the television news that night was, homeless people getting dragged out of housing by the cops. And that was our way of kind of making the point.
Hello, Professor Vitale.
Sorry, you there again?
Yeah, I'm here. I think you.
I
I think you
think
lose.
what happens is that my phone goes into like sleep mode and then turns the app off. So I gotta keep the app off.
Oh,
So
let me ask you this. Look, before you finish, let me ask you this. Are you
yeah,
talking from a phone or a laptop?
a phone.
I think you have to use a laptop.
Well, I think if I just keep the app open, we'll be okay.
Okay.
Yeah, so
Okay.
I'll be more careful
We'll try.
about that.
Okay. Okay.
So let's see. I think I was discussing the two-tier
Yes.
strategy we
Yes.
were using.
Yes.
So
The two-tier
private
strategy.
takeovers and then the big public ones, often on Thanksgiving Day, so that the image on the nightly news that people would see would be of cops dragging homeless people out of housing that could have been housing people but was laying vacant. And so that helped bring, a lot of attention to the warehousing of units and the need for the city to step in and try to get some of these folks to really provide housing for people.
And I think that was kind of the main goal of the Moms for Housing as well. What they got, which why I ask you this, is I don't know if you saw the images of what happened, was this super militarized police force coming down on them with the armored Humvees and
Mm-hmm.
the police officers in full Kevlar and the semi-automatic weapons, really literally ripping them out of the house at I think like 4 or 5 in the morning after the protest had died down. And those images are the ones that went viral. And so the corporation that owned the house just let them have it finally.
That's great. Yes, and I did see some of that imagery, and it just goes to show you the way they assess things like risk. That
Mm-hmm.
the risk to private property is what they're really worried about.
I agree wholeheartedly. And you mentioned that in your book, that the role of police is pretty much meant to protect capital
Yep.
and also kind of control uh, poor people and brown and black people.
Yeah, the way I usually talk about it is that, different historical periods have different economic systems that rely on forms of exploitation, and that policing gets formed in the late 18th and early 19th century in relationship to what were the dominant forms of economic exploitation in that period, which were colonialism,
Mm-hmm.
slavery, and industrialization. And if you
Mm-hmm.
look at the creation of police forces around the world during that period, you can see very concretely that it was a crisis in one or more of those areas that caused them to say, we need this new form of, you know, uh, coercive social control,
Mm-hmm.
that they couldn't rely on the military because it was becoming too expensive and illegitimate. So they said, well, let's look at this new idea of policing, which is developed in relationship to slavery, colonial management, etc. And we can see this in the Europe, in the U.S., and around the world. These are the three driving forces.
Mm-hmm. And in the age of coronavirus, as we're all locked down, I know you're in New York, and the images I've seen in New York look pretty rough, as far as the police. Or is it arresting people or fining people for social distance violations?
You know, they will come and try to give people a warning. Then they might say, well, we're going to give you a ticket. And then the videos you see are basically of people who, at some level, are kind of resisting that.
Mm-hmm.
And then the police do what police do, which is they escalate the encounter because they have to win every battle. And
Oh.
then that escalation takes the form of violence and arrest. And so that's what you see. So in most cases, the police didn't start out the interaction thinking they were going to make an arrest, but
Mm-hmm.
they feel like they're forced into it.
It feels like when I have to deal with them, because again, I'm dealing with mostly mental health issues that are going to go awry. Um, it feels like if I ever have to deal with police, they seem a little confused on how to deal with the issue because in their mind, it's almost a good guy versus bad guy scenario every time they're called. And when they can't figure out who the good guy or bad guy is, they get real agitated.
That's a great point. That's a great point. You're absolutely right. This is the kind of police worldview, this thin blue line kind of lens of seeing the world, which is,
Yeah.
that they're protecting the good people from the bad people, and it's really important to them to divide the world up into the good people and the bad people.
Mm-hmm.
And then that guides how they treat people. And of course, some people are already always guilty of something in the minds of the cops, mostly,
Yes.
young black men and brown men. So
Mm-hmm.
that um, when we get them involved in a situation where it's ambiguous, they're often lost. And in these situations where you're dealing with homeless folks, people with a substance abuse crisis, a mental health crisis, you know, good and bad are irrelevant. These are folks who need help, and police, it's exacerbated because the police don't have the tools to help them.
Mm-hmm.
And then that creates frustration in everybody involved, the police, the person who needs help, etc. And it's just the whole dynamic is incredibly misguided of involving the police in these situations.
And then we're compounding the coronavirus on top of it. So now we have, even when we actually do need emergency services, more often than not, they don't want to be there because they think that everyone in our facility has COVID.
Mm, right.
So
Well,
the
and
yeah.
and what value do the police add in this crisis? The decision to turn a public health problem over to the police is a political decision, and I argue it represents a profound political failure. A failure of the political class that is more concerned about burnishing their own image as tough leaders than they are about supporting the kinds of effective, culturally appropriate, community based, peer to peer public health messaging that would be more effective than just having the politician on television kind of wagging their finger at people, telling them to put a mask on and stay inside.
I, that's so true. I recently read your piece in the New York Daily News
Mm-hmm.
about budget cuts. Your recommendation for budget cuts in the NYPD.
Yeah, so the Policing and Social Justice Project that I coordinate, and we have a staff, and we had conversation about this, and we drafted a proposal that said in a time of real budget crisis, we should not be cutting youth services and health services. We should be cutting the police. So by eliminating new hiring, cutting back on overtime, and cutting back on some surveillance technology, we felt that over about a 5-year period, we could reduce the NYPD budget by $1 billion a year. So about $200 million a year, keep cutting down. And the everyone's like, $1 billion, oh my God, that'll be Armageddon. But then we point out that the NYPD budget has increased by $1 billion in just the last 6 years. So if we cut $1 billion a year out of the budget, we'd be just back to where we were in 2014. So there's plenty of room to make these reductions. Crime is at historic lows. Social distancing is still keeping huge numbers of people off the streets. And the bigger truth is that so much of what the police do is either ineffective or counterproductive. And we just need to eliminate those functions. Vice units, narcotics units, school police, homeless outreach units run by the police department. All of this just needs to be eliminated. And we need to look to how to shift some of those resources into community-based interventions that will be much more effective at resolving the problem.
Now, I'm starting to believe that I'm not going to lie. When in the early days of like Rodney King, so we're talking, what is this, the early mid 90s?
99.
When people were talking about police need body cameras, and that was like a big talking point.
I'm sorry, not 99. Sorry, not 93. Sorry.
Was it 93? Yeah, 93.
Yeah, 93.
Right?
Amadou Diallo, I think, was 99. Sorry.
That was 99, and I actually, okay, yes. Body cameras at this point with law enforcement feel like a selfie stick. It's not deterring anything. I had Shahid Buttar on here a few days ago, who's running against Nancy Pelosi.
Yes, and, I know him.
He was against the body cameras on a whole different, like a surveillance tip. Like, that's a lot of mass surveillance if all these guys are walking around with body cameras. I don't feel like it's really deterring anything. Another thing that people always kind of point to is implicit bias training, which I know they did here in Oakland. What is your take on the deterrence, like implicit bias training and body cameras?
So I've written about both. Here, body cameras, I try to have a slightly more nuanced view of. Mm-hmm. The research shows that it's not having a meaningful impact on policing, and we have some very solid research on that. There is one potential area that needs to be taken seriously, which is that actually some people are getting out of jail because the body camera footage is exonerating them. Okay. So if you talk to like defense attorneys and public defenders, mm-hmm. they will say we're more open to body cameras because for what we do, they've actually been more helpful than harmful. Mm-hmm. You know, the original kind of calculation was like, well, we need more police accountability, and we're willing to give up some privacy to accomplish that. Mm-hmm. But what I'm seeing is no police accountability, just the giving up of privacy. So I'm very skeptical, in our proposal here in New York to reduce the budget by $1 billion includes taking out funding for body cameras. Because I don't think we can justify that at this time.
It was like 18 million in just body cameras, right?
Just in 1 year.
Jesus.
That's just for 1 year. Yeah. That's an ongoing expense. Then on implicit bias training, I think this is a huge boondoggle that is designed to undermine our movements. So implicit bias training rests on this assumption that the problems of race and policing are about unconscious individual decision making by individual police officers. That somehow they just accidentally had a bias towards someone that they weren't aware of, and that slightly skewed their behavior. And then if we could just remind them of this in the future, maybe they won't do it. So this is all total nonsense. First of all, we got a problem of explicit racism in American policing.
Yes, we do.
When we look for the racism, we find it on the chat boards, emails, the official statements of police union leaders. There's plenty of explicit racism. This is not accidental and unintentional. At the same time, though, in Oakland, you've got a lot of non-white police officers and non-white police leadership, and talking about them as racist, as individuals, is not really very helpful or meaningful. The racism is structural. and often operates at the level of political decision making. So that you have this perverse situation where we say, oh, look, the arrest rates for drug crimes are racially disparate.
Mm-hmm.
That must be because the police are unconsciously arresting too many black and brown people. But this is total bullshit. The decision to treat drugs as a criminal justice issue is inherently racist and will always generate racially inequitable enforcement, regardless of the personal views of the police officers. The police did not invent the war on drugs, and they don't really control how it's enforced. It is a political decision. We do not need to give narcotics units anti-bias training. We need to get rid of the war on drugs. Certain communities, their problems are turned into policing problems. And other communities, their problems are addressed in less coercive and punitive ways. So I always say, if you go into a wealthy private high school and some kid is caught with marijuana, nobody's calling the police. Why? Because they know that the parents do not want the police involved with their kids. Why? Because they know that nothing good can come from that. That is going to ruin their kid's life for no good reason. But when it's a poor black or brown kid in a public school, the first thing they do is call the police. Because those kids, in quotes, right, will only understand threats and violence and coercion. We see them as less deserving, always guilty, and that is racist. So anti-bias training and implicit bias training in particular, which just makes my head explode, is used anytime the community says, we're tired of the racism of policing. They say, oh, don't worry. We're going to give the police another $10 million to hire a bunch of former police officers to train them how to be not biased. Or maybe they hire somebody from one of these professional anti-bias groups that make a living from corporate money and police money claiming to solve race problems when actually they make the race problems worse. And this is just providing political cover so that they can keep on doing what they do, waging the war on drugs, war on gangs, war on immigrants, war on crime, right? But with this patina, but it's okay now, we had the training. And then that cuts off the conversation about where the racism really lies. So police chiefs love it. That's why we have so much of it, because it doesn't do anything. If it actually did something, they would be resisting it. The resistance, ironically, is from the rank and file officers. They all know it's total bullshit, and they resent it. And in fact, the research shows that racial disparities in policing often get worse after the training. It actually makes the problem worse for people.
And where I'm at in Oakland, a lot of officers are it's a very multicultural force. We get a ton of Asian officers, a good amount of Latin officers, and definitely a good amount of Black officers. And none of that makes a difference when it comes to who they're stopping.
No. And every single study ever done shows it makes no difference.
James Foreman Jr. wrote a book a few years back called Locking Up Our Own. And the introduction of it was very powerful to me when he paints the scene of a courtroom where he's a public defender defending a young Black man for this quote unquote violent crime. The judge is Black, the bailiff's Black, the arresting officer is Black, and the DA is Black.
Yep.
So it's, at some point, it's got to be the system and not just the players in it.
We're not going to fix that problem with implicit bias training. Yeah, that's a great That's a great book. There's a newer book called Hands Up, Don't Shoot by Jennifer Kobina that looks at Ferguson and Baltimore in
Mm-hmm.
the era of protest there. And it also, her research also shows that the prevalence of black police officers, while people say they want that, and it's understandable that they think that will help, that in fact it helps not at all. It helps not at all. It's a total canard. Again, it's something that makes it appear like they're doing something while doing nothing.
Do you think sometimes it's as simple as the uniform?
I don't think
That
it's the
kind
Go
that
ahead.
kind of I'm sorry, that kind of Stanford experiment, simplistic, like the simplest, like simplifying the Stanford experiment down to it's just you have a uniform and authority, and now you're going to treat me differently, and you no longer see me as a fellow citizen.
I don't think it's the uniform, but it is the position. It is the authority. In fact, some of the worst abuses in policing are from non uniformed officers in gang task forces and anti gun units and narcotic squads. They don't wear uniforms, and they're often the source of the worst abuses, legal abuses, physical abuses, corruption, etc. So it's not the uniform, it's the authority. If you don't want corruption, if you don't want violence, and if you don't want racism in a situation, don't get the police involved. Because
Mm.
policing always automatically comes with those things. And the trick is not to pretend through some fantasy that you can fix the corruption, violence, and racism, because you can't. The solution is to get the police out of the picture in every way we possibly can and come up with better strategies that don't rely on abusive force, authority, etc. Let's actually try to solve problems in humane ways that are often more effective and cheaper.
So does that mean we have to start looking at, for example, the unhoused populations as actual people and not as vagrants and criminals and thieves?
Yes, exactly, because the whole framing of the homelessness as a criminal justice issue is about turning it into a question of individual morality that reduces the responsibility of the political leadership and economic elites for creating the problem. You're homeless because you're a bad person, because you're lazy or whatever. And therefore we have to manage you as a criminal personality instead of saying, oh, you're homeless because of profound market failures that require profound market interventions. But that's, of course, exactly what they don't want. So they need to, for this thing to keep humming along, they need to constantly define these behaviors as criminal.
Mm. and that is the daily issue that I have where I'm at. Because also too that behavior of constantly treating these guys like criminals definitely messes with the way they see themselves and the way they navigate throughout the world,
Yeah,
and
well,
even
of
the way
course.
they're. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, when you treat someone like a criminal and you structure their lives accordingly, that's going to affect over time their sense of who they are and their place in the world, and that creates a kind of negative feedback loop.
Mm.
There's a great book about this in relationship to young people in Oakland called Punished by Victor Rios, and he says, look, from day one, these young black and brown boys are treated as always already guilty of something. And everybody has this preconceived attitude towards them, and this shapes their understanding of who they are and what kind of rights they have and what their place is in American society. And it's incredibly destructive to their personal sense of well-being and possibility.
And it's so hard to like try to get people out of that negative feedback loop. And I see it in things as simple as the food service. You know, we serve them 3 meals a day, and we serve it to them in a what do you call it? Biodegradable paper container, right? Those big takeout containers.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many guys that have been through the prison system. For them, lining up to get dinner is like lining up to get food in jail.
Yeah.
And just trying to break that mold of being like, no, man, quit calling it a tray. Like, let's get you out of that mold first. This is a box of food. Please take your box of food and you can eat it anywhere you want to eat it at.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, people talk about the carceral state, which is that schools, homeless shelters, even some workplaces increasingly feel like prisons where you're under constant surveillance. You're treated as, always suspect. There's, where daily life is managed through threats of punishment, etc. So yeah, it's pervaded our social welfare institutions, hospitals, anywhere there are poor people, they are increasingly treated in the same bad way.
They are, and it's definitely a struggle. So, Mr. Vitale, I want to say thank you for taking the time to talk to me today. I know you're a busy person and you want to enjoy this this holiday, even though every day sometimes feels like a holiday, or what does someone say? Every day feels like Tuesday. I will let you go now. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I'm going to play some music now. Please don't hang up.
You bet.
Professor and author of the book The End of Policing. I will have a link in the description to his most recent piece in the New York Daily News and a few other interviews that he's done, as well as a link to the book The End of Policing. If you haven't done it already, if you can do it, become a patron. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel. Subscribe to us on SoundCloud. Like us. Share it. Before we go, I want to leave with some parting words from Mr. Vitale. Superficial reforms in training, enhanced diversity in body cameras don't address the ways in which ongoing wars against crime, disorder, and drugs serve to reproduce class and race inequalities. Instead, they provide the police with more resources and give them political cover to continue their discriminatory actions. Movements for police accountability and reform must look not to reform police, but to reduce their scope and power. At the same time, they should also be working toward restorative justice practices, as well as jobs, education, and health care for our youth. Those are the words of our guest today, Alex Vitale. Thank you guys again for listening. And stay tuned for the next issue of Soundwaves.